think that's what's known as a pregnant pause. Thank you very much to the JCPA and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I believe that I've been asked to speak today as part of the comic relief because I'm going to be speaking about BBC Impartiality. What I have done today, what I'm bringing you today, is an analysis which I think is possibly for the first time of BBC Arabic. BBC Arabic has been broadcast for some time on radio, and this month went live on television. The wonderful thing from the BBC's point of view about BBC Arabic is almost the only people that understand what they're saying, and therefore the only people that are likely to criticize it are Arabic speakers, and there's a relatively small number of them in the West. And possibly few of those are inclined to criticize what the BBC is actually putting about. What I want to just do is bring you some examples of what is actually being broadcast on BBC Arabic. And I'll just explain for a moment how I've done this. I took the main BBC News programme and recorded it for 4 weeks during the Lebanon War. I then translated all of the guest speakers, everything that was said by the guest speakers and indeed the interviewers, and I've then tried to classify the guest speakers as to whether they are pro one side or the other side of the conflict or are neutral in their general approach. Now sometimes it's not been terribly difficult. If one takes a spokesperson from Misrad Quds, one can assume they're pro-Israel. If you take a spokesperson from Hezbollah, then one can assume that they are pro-Hezbollah. Some of the speakers, of course, are more difficult to classify, but in fact what emerges is most of them are fairly clear, fairly easy to classify. Now I want to take you initially to, if I can, to one element of the BBC guidelines. This is the only bit of law which is coming into this talk. The BBC will tell you they have to be fair and neutral. That's not right. They actually have in their guidelines due impartiality does not require absolute neutrality on every issue or detachment from fundamental democratic principles. What this means, I believe, is that where you are faced with two different events, one has to recognize there isn't necessarily a moral equivalence between a terrorist attack and self-defense, and a nation, a sovereign state employing its right of self-defense. So, for example, if one was looking at the way in which the BBC operated this obligation not to be detached from fundamental democratic principles, one would think that if it's faced with Hezbollah and Iran, Hezbollah, which the UK government recognises as a terrorist organisation, Iran, which is probably the greatest existential threat to the West today in terms of its nuclear aims and its genocidal ambitions. And then face that with Israel, which has all of the elements of a democracy. It has obviously representative government, it has a fair and independent judiciary, and it has a very free press. You would think that the BBC would be anxious to demonstrate that it has in fact not detached itself from fundamental democratic principles. If one looks therefore at the number of representatives that it invites to its programme, this is what we see. Hezbollah and Iran, 17, Israel, 5. More than 3 times as many go to the undemocratic than the democratic. Now let's just look at briefly what they talk about. I want to start off by just classifying some of the anti-American, which I take to be also anti-Western views which are expressed. And I've taken these quotations. There's a large schedule which you can get on the BBC Watch website, which contains the full quotations, of which these are obviously minor selections, but I believe properly representative of the attitudes of the speakers. The Bush government wanted to have complete control over the world which is controlled by the US. As we know, on the Arab street, if your enemy is Israel or America, you are on the right side. This is an interesting one for Condoleezza Rice. There is a kind of vision in the American government to crush the Palestinians completely and to take all their lands. I'm not quite sure where they get that from, but doubtless it's well known. The Americans constantly talk about breaking the hearts and minds of the Arabs and Muslims. This new American strategy is totally contrary to the principles of human rights. Hezbollah has been leading this fight with dignity and justice. The positions of Europe and America center on their own obsessions, their war on terror, and they have considered Hezbollah a terrorist group, which is, of course, wrong. These are the attitudes towards Israel. Now, we're talking about the delegitimization of Israel. Let's look at the way Israel is spoken about. Again, this is a representative sample of the attitudes which the BBC is putting out. Israel is said to have evil objectives, this way of twisting things, and the aggressive attitude. The Israeli military machine works to a great extent based on hatred. Israelis are violating all international law. It turns out there's every single one. They've carefully gone through and they're violating every single bit of international law. Then we get to the somewhat more hysterical language. We talk about the barbaric Israeli attack, the barbaric Israeli army. Lebanon is facing a barbaric war. These are all different, not necessarily everyone is a different person, but these are different quotations from different people. They are destroying villages completely. They are racist and barbaric. It gets a little bit more exciting. We are facing a monster who does not care about the law or about morals, a killer monster. Israel is the deadly monster, a destructive monster. They refer to a month of killing our children, and this is collective punishment, and good old famous canard, Nazi punishment. These are comments coming out on BBC radio, effectively uncontradicted by the person who's interviewing them. And now we get complete pure lies. They are committing massacres. The atrocities in Lebanon that we have seen so far from Israel, including all of their massacres. There's a large number of these massacres which some of the international press appear to have missed. There is a need for an assurance against further Israeli massacres. Israel, and now I'm going to just give you a few of the comments which are so ridiculous that I've put them under the heading absurd comments. Israel is a country that wants to expand, and they have a plan to force on to the regions of Palestine, Lebanon, and even Egypt. So these are the this is the colonialist ambitions which Israel has. The fact that they've withdrawn from all of these places is not actually mentioned. All the massacres committed by Israel, like no one in history has seen something similar. It is even worse than what Germany committed. Now, those of you who've studied some history will find that an interesting comparison. Barbaric Israel attacks, I love this one, which kills everybody, everywhere. We should be very grateful that we're still alive. Israel is extensively targeting every part of Lebanon. What was absolutely noticed by everybody is that they were only targeting the southern part of Lebanon, which is where Hezbollah was. These are crimes unprecedented historically. Turns out that they are unprecedented historically, and all students of history, please take note. We'd be very interested to see the comparisons. If any of you want to conduct some further studies, you might consider going to hear Dr. Anwar Ashki, the director of the Middle East Center for Strategic and Legal Studies in Saudi Arabia. Strategy and law obviously being his strong points. He's obviously got an interesting view on history as well, and he came out with this gem. We faced Israel in 1967 and won militarily. These, again, this is a hysterical, extreme views which are being put across, not by Al Jazeera, not by Al Arabi, but being put across by the BBC, funded by British taxpayers to the tune of $8 billion a year. They are putting out, they're the most powerful news organization in the world. Because they have legal obligations to be fair and impartial, they have considerable weight. And they are giving weight to these extreme views. Let's just look at some dangerous comments, which is extraordinary given British and Western foreign policy are being stated. Of course, we have Hezbollah referred to as martyrs, the honor resistance. Again, Hezbollah are clear that their operation targeted military objectives is clear that their operation targeted military objectives, not civilians, as did Israel. In fact, there was a blanket attack of missiles which were not guided at all and killed a number of civilians in Israel. And this is extraordinary. I hope that Iran has something to scare Israel. As an Arab citizen from the Middle East, I wish that all Arab countries would have nuclear weapons. This is being put out by something organised, paid for by the British taxpayer, partly funded by the British Foreign Office. This is not consistent with British foreign policy, as far as I understand it, that all Arab countries would have nuclear weapons. I will ask Iran and every Arab country, this is a completely separate comment, and every Arab country you can, to have nuclear weapons. This is the BBC's Arabic service in radio, and of course television is far more powerful than radio, and television started, I think, last week. I've taken out the neutrals, which there were a very small number. We have pro-Hezbollah 82%, pro-Israel 18%. So you get an idea. This is the attachment to fundamental democratic principles. This is the way the BBC understands it. And almost nobody that doesn't speak Arabic can see this. It's invisible to everyone. Now I'm going to end by having a very, very quick look at another study. There's a copy of that study is going to be out in the hall when you go and take coffee, and there's going to be copies of another study out in the hall, which I'm just going to flick through for 3 minutes. Do I have 3 minutes left? Right. A study which I carried out. It was particularly interesting because it gives a view of the way the BBC journalists think. There is a tiny corner of the website called The World in Pictures. And a journalist is asked, almost at random, in the morning, the end of the morning meeting, and I've interviewed the head of the website who's explained this to me, told, you go and do the World in Pictures today. And they throw 10 or 12 pictures onto the website, and those 10 or 12 pictures are meant to be, just interesting things going on in the world, and also in some way or other summarize world events. I looked at 6 months worth of pictures. That's 10 or 12 over 6 months. I took out all the ones which related to Israel, Palestine, not the whole of the Middle East, but also including Iraq. And this was a couple of years ago, was the period that I looked at. And it's fascinating to see. And I then interviewed the person, the head of the website, and I said, are you monitoring these? Are you looking to see whether or not there are pro-Israel or anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, Palestinian? And he said, are you mad? Why should I monitor it? It's just a little bit of the website. I just asked one of my journalists to throw a few pictures up towards the beginning of the day. How can I monitor that? In other words, what he said was, there are a few things about which we consider an obligation to monitor, but by no means everything. And they actually were surprised that someone should be asking that they monitor whether or not they monitor their own product. What we therefore get is, over a 6-month period, the pictures which go up effectively are a window into the soul of the journalists that are selecting those pictures. They reflect in a natural way what these journalists think about the correct way the world should be presented. And let's just have a look at this. So this is, I call it Pictures of Prejudice, and this is a breakdown of the political images. It's interesting, that tiny little slither you see there is Darfur, where at the time there were ethnic cleansing, massacres, millions of people being thrown out of their homes, government-sponsored attacks on individuals. That received one picture in 6 months. The rest of the world had the majority. Iraq, where the Iraq War was at its height, received about the same as Israel, where the only thing that was going on, the Intifada, had finished, and the only thing that was going on was Israel was getting ready to withdraw from Gaza. So even when nothing effectively is happening in Israel, it receives as much attention as Iraq, and about 20 times what Darfur is receiving. Looking at the breakdown with some neutrals, I'll take you to without neutrals, and there you see the good old, they're consistent. You've got to admit the BBC is consistent, about 20% pro-Israeli, about 80% pro-Palestinian. And I'm just going to show you some of the pictures. In theory, it's not always easy to tell whether a picture is pro or anti any particular group. But let's look at a few and you'll see how I haven't found it so difficult to classify. First of all, Palestinians, it turns out, if they are male, are unarmed and generally praying. So we have here Palestinians in prayer, Palestinians in prayer. The men tend to be unarmed and often elderly. Palestinians in prayer. Very frequently, Palestinians are shown as female, often children, and usually clutching the photographs of their loved ones, brothers, husbands, that are incarcerated for no apparent reason, by the ghastly Israeli Zionist colonialist entity. So we have this kind of picture here, all holding the pictures of all of their loved ones that are being held by Israelis in Israeli prisons. Here's one whose father has just been released, another one here, and yet another one here. This is a constant image, very attractive, beautiful faces, pathetically clutching the picture of his older brother. No mention ever as to why that older brother might be in prison somewhere, just these images of these pathetic children parted from their brothers and fathers or whatever. There's one more. Israel is depicted almost entirely male, armed, and very often their faces are covered so that you can't actually see them. They're faceless individuals. So we see, for instance, this individual, you can see that it's an Israeli soldier, but you can't actually see the features of the face. Here's a particularly nice picture, the harmless elderly Palestinian with this, the symbol of Israel is just the gun held anonymously pointing at him. I think it's a slightly amusing picture because it's taken a moment too early. It's obviously posed, and the guy is smiling, and I don't think that was intentional. He's meant to look terrified and threatened, but unfortunately the one they put up was a little bit early. Here we have a typical Israeli soldier, sandbagged, with his helmet and the light not really able to see in his features. All you see is the weapon and the sandbags. And I love this picture. Where you do see Israeli soldiers' faces, there's 5 armed Israelis around one apparently kneeling Palestinian woman. The caption, each picture has a caption. Here you do see Israelis haughty, standing around in a rather haughty fashion. This is Yom HaZikaron. This is the way the BBC decides to portray that particular event. The one typical pro-Jewish picture is, of course, of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, and here you've got a pathetic, dead, persecuted, homeless, stateless Jew. You can put forward in a sympathetic light, and they're the ones that get the sympathetic coverage. Compare that with the way the Palestinians are presented. Here you've got this beautifully composed picture with the light just shining upon this dignified, elderly, harmless-looking gentleman in his very impoverished surroundings. Here we have a picture of a typical Palestinian scene, which we're all very familiar with, fishing, and another very typical, this is an armed Palestinian, in case you hadn't noticed that. He's got a pitchfork, evoking this delightful image of harmless, charming people in this rustic scene who wouldn't hurt a fly. Where you do see the Palestinian police, they're disciplined and entirely unarmed, which is quite interesting. And finally, the Malaysian elections. One might wonder why the Malaysian elections are selected here, but as soon as you see the way the Malaysian elections are portrayed by the BBC and the World in Pictures, you'll understand why I've chosen them. How better to portray and explain the Malaysian elections than to show a apparently Malaysian woman walking past a wall of 4 posters depicting peace in Palestine. And if you look a little closer, it's difficult to see. Peace in Palestine, you've got a picture on the top left of each of these posters of 2 little children holding hands, and in the background an Israeli tank moving towards them. And the picture below is 2 other Palestinian children sitting on a heap of rubble, which presumably is the remains of their house after the tank has done its business. This is, of course, the way in which most people think of the Malaysian elections, and therefore I can understand exactly why they've done it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the way the BBC uses its power, the way the BBC impartially presents what's going on in the Middle East, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is the way in which the BBC delegitimizes the State of Israel. Thank you.